So allow me again to welcome you on behalf of the Purdawood Center for the Study of the Iranian World, the Program of Iranian Studies at NELC, and the Kotzen Institute of Archaeology that is graciously hosting this event in its low key to the second lecture of the 10th Ehsan Yarshater lecture series at UCLA, held by my esteemed colleague, Professor Daniel Potts. For those who have joined us only now, just a brief expose on the impetus for the Yarshater lectures and some biographical notes on our guests. The Yarshater lecture series was inspired by Les Leçons au Collège de France and endowed by the late Professor Ehsan Yarshater, among others, at UCLA, Harvard, and the Sorbonne. They are delivered by a distinguished scholar whose work has lastingly impacted the study of the Iranian world. Each series consists of 4 to 5 lectures on a single theme that is subsequently elaborated and amplified into a monograph. The lectures thus represent original research and synthesis on all aspects of Iranian studies, including archaeology, history, art history, literature, the study of religion, and philosophy. Dr. Daniel Potts, our Yarshater lecturer this year, is Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Archaeology and History at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient Worlds, ISAW, at New York University. He is obviously a product of Harvard University, having received there both his AB in 1975. AB is the unique way to say a BA at Harvard. He received both his AB in 1975 and his PhD in 1980. The latter from the Department of Anthropology with a specialty in Near Eastern archaeology. Before joining ISAW at NYU, Professor Potts taught previously at the Freie Universität Berlin, the University of Copenhagen, and the University of Sydney, where he held the Edwin Cuthbert Hall Chair of Middle Eastern Archaeology, and I hope that I shall not pronounce it a third time. It's such a long title. His main areas of interest are Greater Iran, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf, and as a field archaeologist, he has conducted numerous excavations, among others, in Iran and Turkey. He is equally at ease with the antique world of Elam in the 3rd millennium, as he is with the Sasanian Empire in late antiquity, and has authored a work that is vertiginous both by its abundance and versatility. Once more, I would like to single out his monograph on Elam, The Archaeology of Elam, Formation and Transformation of an Ancient Iranian State, with Cambridge University Press, which exquisitely illustrates his ability to command over manifold archaeological, literary, and epigraphic data, as well as showcases his capacity innovatively to synthesize them in the longue durée. After a sweeping methodological introduction on Monday, in his lecture today, Aspects of Kinship in Iranian Prehistory, Dan Potts shall be examining the use of ceramics to infer on group affinities, that is, whether ceramics may reflect on patterns of marriage and residence within and between prehistoric communities, whether they inform us about social endogamy, dowries, and the notion of tribe in prehistoric and ancient Iran. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Potts.
Thank you again very much for your kind introduction, Rahim. Hopefully they'll get shorter and shorter as we get through the 5 lectures. Right. Well, as I noted in my opening lecture, whereas social anthropologists can interview their informants, archaeologists and ancient historians obviously cannot. In one respect, this is an obvious disadvantage. In another sense, however, it leaves the door wide open for speculation that can be difficult to refute, or at least be shown to be less than plausible once it gets enshrined in the literature. Given the absence of written sources, any reconstruction of the social organization of the earliest sedentary societies in the Near East, more particularly in Iran, is always going to be speculative, even at a biological level, assuming human skeletal remains from cemeteries could be recovered, from which DNA could be extracted, or teeth were excavated, which preserved epigenetic traits sufficient to establish kinship, we might be in a position to tell that people were related, but this is to be expected in any relatively small community and such analyses would not tell us how they were related or what kind of kinship patterns were present. Although Ernst Herzfeld claimed, quote, that back to prehistoric times goes the fourfold graduation of Iranian social order into Nimana, house, vis, clan, Zantu, tribe, and Dahyu, people, we have no way of verifying this claim. And a priori, it seems more likely that the pre- or non-Iranian groups inhabiting Iran in prehistory were not organized according to the same principles by which the later Iranians were, at least according to the Avesta. Nevertheless, some categories of finds from Neolithic and Chalcolithic contexts, say roughly from the period about 8,000 to 3,500 BC, have been adduced in discussions of society and social relations, albeit in a rather oblique fashion. Let us look at this material to see whether something other than DNA can be derived from it. Non-archaeologists who have even a passing acquaintance with Near Eastern archaeological literature dealing with some portion of the last 8,000 or 9,000 years are probably aware of the outsized significance of ceramics in the study of the ancient Near East. The reduction of a mass of data, often comprising thousands and thousands of broken pieces of pottery, into a coherent typology of forms and decorations that may be taken as the ceramic signature of a site and compared with the ceramic signatures of other sites, is among the primary aims of such a study. To say that work like this is labor-intensive, often tedious and frequently an end in itself, is an understatement. The difficulty, of course, arises in deriving social insights from typological data. When I was a student, a powerful reaction set in against the notion, often derided as hopelessly simplistic, that pots equal people. In other words, that the ceramic assemblage of a site as a cultural signature characterized the site's inhabitants and could be used to chart interaction, trade, conquest, movements of people, and so forth. Deploying a sort of neo-Boasian logic, it was argued that material culture, language, and race, by which we might better today say biological group affinity, varied independently of each other. Hence, people might belong to linguistically and biologically different groups, but still use similar material culture. Conversely, they might belong to the same biological or linguistic group, but use different sorts of material culture. The warning was therefore clear. Do not assume that a pottery style or assemblage, by which we understand the totality of forms, decorative modes, and functional categories at a given site, or from one stratigraphic level at a site, denotes a particular human social unit. Most of the time, however, archaeologists have found it almost impossible to uncouple a ceramic style or its regional distribution at a series of contemporary sites within a circumscribed area, such as the so-called Lapui pottery of 4th millennium BC date that was first identified on the Marv Dasht Plain, a map of which you see here, from the notion of a social group, even though they have long since given up calling such things like the buffware culture or the grayware culture, drawing a name from the chief characteristic of the pottery of a region, or in interpreting the wares present at a given site as emblematic of distinct cultures, as Donald E. McCowan did in 1942, when, for example, he suggested that the so-called light-toned pottery and the redware of Tepe Sialk I typify two different cultures. In the most egregious cases, such a group might be conceptualized as a tribe or a confederation of tribes, without giving even a moment's thought to just what a tribe is. I shall have more to say on this a bit later in the lecture. More commonly, however, the explicit characterization of a ceramically defined group as a band, a lineage, a tribe, a clan, a community, a people, and so forth is left unstated, although the implicit identification of a ceramic assemblage or stylistic horizon with a human group remains. Technological ascriptions, intentional or inadvertent, also exist. Thus, for example, when the late Robert H. Dyson Jr. identified an early software horizon in Iran in the second edition of Robert Erich's Chronologies in Old World Archaeology in 1965, he was actually pointing to the prevalence of a shared technology of pottery vessel construction by hand and of firing, later investigated by Pamela Vandiver, who called it sequential slab construction because of the use of individual slabs of clay to build up the body of a vessel. Perhaps equally disconcerting in some treatments of ceramics in prehistoric Iran is the ease with which scholars discuss ceramic assemblages as if they were living and breathing organisms, without acknowledging the social architecture behind them. In the archaeological literature, ceramic assemblages appear, grow, diversify, jump from one region to another, and contract. Nobody nowadays is quite as blunt as McCown was in 1942. Discussing period 1-4 at Tepe Sialk, for example, he wrote, quote, "The redware culture began to influence the lightware culture of Sialk I. By the time of Sialk II, the redware culture was predominant and had eliminated the use of lightware." More recently, the organismic analogy is implicit, almost never explicit. Assemblages and styles may stand isolated, they may integrate, they may hybridize, as if a form of ceramic natural selection were at work, an unseen hand shepherding this material along over centuries, even millennia. The fundamental difficulty, of course, is that archaeologists are often capable of identifying and describing phenomena for which they can offer no explanation. When explanations are proffered, however, it is incumbent upon us to consider whether they are necessary or sufficient. Following an old practice in North American archaeology, some ceramic assemblages, ware groups, or stylistic decorative groups are named after so-called type sites, that is, the sites where they were first recorded or where they were particularly well represented, or after villages or towns in the research area. This approach is not universal in Iran, but where American archaeologists have worked, such names have sometimes been used. Scholars who have adopted this practice include Joseph Caldwell at Tala Iblis in Kerman province, Robert Dyson at Hassanlu in the Urmia Basin, and William Sumner at Talimalian in the Marvdash Plain of Fars. In the case of prehistoric Fars, for example, the late William Sumner suggested, quote, "The presence of Jari, Kutahi, Bizdan, and possibly local styles in Kazarun and Sarvistan implies a degree of cultural isolation in the plains of the valleys of Fars." On the basis of later research by the Mamasani Archaeological Project, which I co-directed, this view was queried by Lloyd Weeks and his co-authors, who pointed to the presence at some sites in the area of shells from the Persian Gulf, copper from the central Iranian plateau, obsidian from eastern Anatolia or southern Armenia, and bitumen from Khuzestan or Iraq. Moreover, they also stressed the fact that Kutahi ware has been found near Shiraz, while Jalyan and Bizdan wares are attested in Faza and Darab, all of which speaks against this isolationist perspective. Indeed, they suggest just the opposite, and I concur completely with them. But there's a further implication in what Sumner wrote that I believe has been overlooked. Going back to what I said a moment ago about pots and people, I'm a firm believer that pottery manufacture became industrialized and potting became a profession before pottery manufacture became industrialized and potting became a profession. It was situated physically in the individual households of families, what Max Weber called the Hausgemeinschaft, where pottery was made by and for a household's or group of households' own use. It does not follow, of course, that on a technical level, each household potter used perceptibly different methods. On the contrary, at any given point in time, there was probably always broad uniformity in manufacturing technique, with some measure of variation according to personal idiosyncrasies, experimentation, or a desire to do things in a different way, accounting for regional variation. Decoration, furthermore, certainly varied as well. Within a community, there may have been broad norms and mental templates on which potters based their designs, as well as variation caused by individual tastes, artistic ability, coordination, and sensibility. Taken out of its community context and compared with the products of another village or kin group, pottery styles may have seemed even more distinctive and distinguishable, not because potters tried consciously to express their group identity, but because the way they saw the world, the way they'd been taught by their kin, had given them a distinctive potting signature. Hence, where different styles, as defined by archaeologists, appear simultaneously, for example, in the same archaeological stratum or series of strata at one site, I would interpret this not as a sign of isolation, but of co-location of different styles in one community. The question is, how might such co-location have come about? Obviously, barter or exchange could affect a spread of stylistically distinctive pottery between communities. But in societies where most goods produced in the household largely remained in the household, the appearance of diverse styles in one and the same settlement might instead indicate the presence of individuals from different communities, not because of trade and exchange, but because of marriage patterns. In other words, the practice of exogamy could create a situation in which diverse styles that show no apparent relation to each other appear alongside one another on an archaeological site. This sort of hypothesis was queried 30 years ago by Reinhard Bernbeck in his study of the Neolithic pottery from Kali-Rustam in the Bakhtiari Mountains. As he pointed out, in Americanist investigations of ceramic production and kinship, three assumptions prevailed. First, that ceramic production was done in most cases by women. Second, that the crafts of pottery making and decoration were passed on from mother to daughter. And third, that a unified ceramic assemblage with respect to form and decoration over time implied that the women, that is, the makers of the pottery, remained in their original settlements after marriage and did not move to those of their husbands, if in fact exogamy was practiced. In other words, whether marriage was endogamous or exogamous, residence was matrilocal. In this way, the ceramic repertoire of the place was reproduced from generation to generation. Through recourse to modern ethnographic analogies in Morocco and the Philippines, Bernbeck satisfied himself that household, as opposed to organized industrial pottery production, has in fact generally been a female occupation. I would add on the question of industrial scale ceramic factories that in ancient Mesopotamia, where these are attested in a wealth of cuneiform sources from the end of the 3rd millennium BC, men were the potters. But for purposes of interrogating the more remote past, my concern is not so much whether pottery was made by men or women. Rather, the main issue is whether the ceramic assemblage of an archaeological site is stylistically, in form and decoration, relatively homogeneous, whether the decorative patterns appear consistent or not within a particular design vocabulary. I say this because at Toli Nurabad in Western Fars, around 6000 BC, where I worked between 2003 and 2010, the situation is one of extreme variability. In other words, all of the pottery you see here appears side by side, stratigraphically and chronologically speaking. And it is clearly a very diverse assemblage on a decorative level. This could suggest exogamy. If men made the pottery, then this degree of diversity could imply that they went to live in the home villages or settlements of their wives, bringing with them, however, their own decorative patterns on pottery they continued to manufacture for household use. If women made the pottery, on the other hand, then it would imply that they went to the home villages of their husbands, continued to make pottery for their new households, and thereby introduced new decorative patterns. We may not be able to decide on whether residence in a given prehistoric situation was patrilocal or matrilocal, but the high degree of ceramic variation within an assemblage like that of Neolithic Toli Nurabad could be explained by exogamy. In 1971, William Allen and James B. Richardson III stressed that the determination of residence patterns was fraught with difficulty, archaeologically. Indeed, as they noted, discussing a Pacific example, two anthropologists studying the same community and interviewing the same households came to diametrically opposed views on the question of whether residents in the community they studied should be considered patrilocal or ambilocal, that is mixed, in which some married couples resided matrilocally while others resided patrilocally. They also stressed the enormous divergence between ideal norms, what people say they do, and what they actually do. They questioned the assumption that one can recover any uniformly prescriptive or preferential rules of residence. In fact, they suggested that, quote, given the multiplicity of obstacles that confront archaeologists in their attempts to make meaningful statements about prehistoric kinship systems, it seems justified to conclude that unless extremely detailed historic data exists, the analysis of kinship is best left to the ethnographer. All of this should be heeded, and cautionary tales abound, but it is at one level irrelevant since, in my opinion, the degree of variation seen in an assemblage like Toli Norabad is consistent with population admixture, and so long as pottery production in the Neolithic was a household activity, it seems that regardless of the residence pattern or patterns followed, exogamy is more likely to have played a role than wildly divergent aesthetic sensibilities from household to household. A decade ago, the Chicago researcher Abbas Alizadeh made a novel suggestion concerning the presence of what he referred to as pottery in a hybrid style in Chalcolithic graves at Hakalan and Dumgar Pachine in the Pushti Ku, Loristan. Quote, the hybrid style of some painted pottery vessels not found elsewhere, he suggested, may not only be attributed to the practice of interregional marriages, assuming women were active in pottery production, it also fits nicely with the mobile characteristic of migratory tribes. Leaving aside this reference to so-called migratory tribes, about which I shall have more to say a bit later, it is intriguing that whereas I've just pointed to residence patterns and exogamy as mechanisms which could account for the appearance of utterly distinctive painted pottery types at one site, in one level, through the arrival of their makers, whether men or women, in the communities of their spouses, Alizadeh considered hybridity a result of exogamy. Elsewhere, he speculated, quote, if women were active potters or pot painters in prehistory, interregional marriages in patrilocal societies certainly would lead to the spread of specific pottery styles that in the course of time would become either diluted or would undergo hybridization. While this may in theory be possible, such an explanation would require that a potter from an outside community adopted some of the stylistic conventions of his or her new family or group and combined these with their own conventional patterns. Certainly in the case of Toli Norabad, hybridity is not the issue, but rather the co-location of completely different styles in one and the same stratigraphic level, suggesting that if potters from outside communities changed their places of residence, they continued to make pottery as they always had done and did not fuse the styles of their new home with those of their traditional praxis. Regardless of how close to the mark or otherwise these speculations on ancient pottery production in Iran may be, we cannot escape one obdurate fact, namely that the potters and painters of ancient Iranian ceramics will forever be anonymous. One qualification to this statement, however, is prompted by the widely documented, if far from universal practice, of inscribing or painting marks on pottery, that is, so-called potter's marks. Many years ago, I undertook a study of the incised potter's marks from Tepe Yahya in Kerman province as part of my dissertation, and shortly after publishing a paper on these, another appeared by the French prehistorian Geneviève Dollfus and the linguist Pierre Encrevet, discussing the painted potter's marks on 5th millennium BC pottery from Tepe Jafarabad, Tepe Bendabal, and Tepe Jawi in Susiana. At that time, I was interested in the possibility that the potter's marks of Tepe Yahya preserved some graphic similarities with so-called Proto-Elamite or Susa III writing, attested at Susa and other sites, including Tepe Yahya, which were conveyed through contact via Baluchistan to the Indus Valley, where similar signs are attested in the Harappan script. This is not a suggestion I would adhere to today, and in fact, if I were to reanalyze the potter's marks of any ancient Iranian site now, I would work from considerably different premises. Many scholars have assumed that pottery was marked by prehistoric potters prior to firing in communal kilns so that their products were easily recognizable and retrievable. As a corollary, some scholars have suggested that post-firing marks indicate ownership. In 1983, the late K.C. Chang pointed out that at several sites in China, certain marks were common on the pottery of particular areas within a site, leading him to suggest that these were not the marks of potters, but were rather markers and emblems of families, lineages, clans, or divisions of these. This is analogous to the tamga, used much later by steppe groups and Iranians, a subject that I'll address in my last lecture. A somewhat similar explanation was proposed by Abbas Alizadeh for the marks on Susiana pottery published by Dollfuss and Encrevet and attested at Chogamish as well. Given that over 200 potter's marks were found at Chogamish, Alizadeh suggested these were unlikely to represent the marks of individual potters. There are just too many of them, preferring to see them as marks that indicated household or corporate groups who either had their vessels baked in a common kiln or else identified their vessels in common storage facilities, of which there is no evidence, and which I find highly unlikely. In this regard, it is interesting to note that in a wide-ranging review of non-industrial ceramic production around the world, the late Carol Kramer found that while, quote, some potters use identification marks, even in the absence of such marks, potters can usually identify their own products, and often those made by other potters in their community as well. Another type of marking which probably did not obtain in ancient Iran, at least in the prehistoric era, was the marking of pottery with the name or mark of a customer or a purchaser. This implies a market and professionalization of pottery manufacture that only came much later in time. I would like to turn now to another aspect of how ceramics in ancient Iran have been interpreted. Exogamous marriage patterns have also been invoked to account for the geographical distribution of a single, largely homogeneous and easily recognizable category of ceramics, so-called Bakun A pottery. Named after the Chalcolithic site of Talibakun near Persepolis, first investigated in the spring and summer of 1932 by Alexander Langsdorff and Donald McCown, the Bakun A ceramic assemblage, dating to the early 5th millennium BC, is dominated by a distinctive, well-fired, black-painted buffware. This, however, was not, in my opinion, produced in individual households. It was made by highly skilled potters who had access to well-controlled kilns and were capable of replicating their products on a reliable basis. Although Alizadeh suggested that, quote, interregional marriages, an important factor in forging interregional alliances through kinship, could also be considered as a contributing factor in the spread of some classes of pottery, he was adamant that in the case of very fine Bakun A pottery, its spatial distribution corresponded to, quote, the locations of summer-winter pastures of the tribes of Kashkai, Bakhtiari, Khamsa, Mamasani, and Boyer Ahmad confederacies, and hence he argued that nomadic tribes dispersed Bakun A culture over vast areas. One wonders, of course, where these hypothetical nomads acquired the fine Bakun A type pottery they are alleged to have carried with them all over Fars, since Alizadeh has not suggested it was actually made by them, and why a scholar so fond of ethnographic analogies would not have read more about the absence of pottery amongst the very nomadic groups he cites as a model for 5th millennium behavior. For example, the French anthropologist Jean-Pierre Digard, who lived with and has written extensively on the Bakhtiari, noted that they only used organic materials, such as wood, along with wool, skin, hair, and fleece, while pottery was totalement absent in Bakhtiari life. But these and other arguments for very early nomadism in Iran have been exhaustively dissected and I think refuted in my 2014 book on nomadism in Iran. And as they have little more to do with kinship, I will leave that topic for the moment. Along with an interest in exogamy as a mechanism for the diffusion of Bakun A ceramics, Alizadeh also speculated on social endogamy, prompted by the architectural and glyptic record at Talibakun. In 2006, he wrote of, quote, a change in social structure that we can barely see archaeologically. That is, a separation of kinship from economic and political considerations. The internally specialized nature of the settlement at Talibakun A and the system of control exercised by some to limit access to certain parts of the community is taken as indicative of the presence of at least two class endogamous strata. Further, he suggested, quote, since Talibakun A was a prehistoric society in which kinship ties may still have been strong enough to be a major factor in the workings of the socioeconomic organization, it can be postulated that Building 4, which you see here in yellow, belonged to a father who carried seal 1 and his two children who carried seals 3 and 5. We have here a series of inferences based on the archaeological evidence from Talibakun A. First, that the social order at the site consisted of two or more strata that were class endogamous, by which I assume he means marriage was restricted to members of one's class and did not occur across the classes of Bakune society. And second, that stamp sealings from 3 different seals found in one particular building can be attributed to a male and 2 of his children, whether male or female. Regarding the first of these inferences, social class endogamy is a well-attested phenomenon. In his posthumously published Wirtschaftsgeschichte, Max Weber identified class endogamy, according to which daughters from elite clans married only their social equals, as one of the factors that contributed to the breakdown of the patriarchal Hausgemeinschaft. More recently, as van Leeuwen and Maas noted, quote, social endogamy refers to marrying within the same class and thus assumes the existence of a limited number of discrete classes, while social homogamy refers to marrying someone of approximately the same status and thus assumes the existence of a continuous status scale. One doesn't need to have seen Downton Abbey and read Anthony Trollope or Jane Austen to be able to conjure up many examples of social endogamy. However, as van Leeuwen and Maas correctly observed, the assumption of discrete classes is integral to the concept, and it surely stretches credulity to infer the existence of 2 social classes, 2 or more social classes at Talibakun A, simply because someone sealed off the door of a storage room, thereby implying that some individuals had access to its contents while others did not. Equally suspect, moreover, is Alizade's inference about seal ownership. This was based on the recovery of 63 door sealings, the impressed designs of which revealed the use of 3 different seals in Building 4. Of these, Seal 1 accounted for 36 sealings, Seal 5 for 15, and Seal 3 for 12. Alizade's inference about the familial relationship between the owners, or more precisely, the users of these 3 seals, ignores a significant chronological consideration that should be raised. Having been found in one archaeological horizon at Talibakun A, by no means indicates that the sealings were produced in a very short space of time. The archaeological horizon here is surely not less than a century, and in fact, Alizadeh grants it 4 centuries, from 4500 to 4100 BC. Thus, many scenarios could be invoked to account for the presence of sealings from 3 different seals in one building. The seals could have all belonged to one individual who, in the course of a lifetime spanning decades, used 3 seals, whether successively or concurrently. They could have belonged to 3 individuals, united by kinship ties or unrelated, who were responsible for the building in 3 successive centuries. Theoretically, ownership or stewardship of the building may have changed hands during the 400-year occupation of Talibakun A, and multiple generations may have separated the users of each seal. These are just a few of the concerns I have with Alizadeh's narrative of seal ownership at Talibakun. In addition to patrilocal and matrilocal residence, another pattern not yet considered in my discussion is neolocal residence. That is, a situation in which a married couple moves away from their parental homes and establishes an entirely new residence. This raises an interesting point about archaeological site formation, which is often overlooked or at least not commented upon. Archaeologists are very familiar with the concept of virgin soil, that is, the ground surface on which the initial occupation of a settlement occurred. But we are not, I think, in the habit of considering the demographic implications of that first occupation of a site, which may in fact imply a neolocal residence pattern in the sense that the human actors involved had to have come from somewhere else before settling on virgin soil. The population implications are unclear, however, and need not necessarily reflect population growth and the fission of pre-existing settlement, with some inhabitants moving away to found a new one. As Arnold Wilson observed in 1908, quote, "The Persian habit of deserting villages and houses and of rebuilding houses when necessary upon new sites is too well known to require mention." A new settlement or resettlement, of course, need not only occur at the start of a site's life. Archaeological sites are often abandoned, sometimes for good, but often for an interval of time that might range from months and years to centuries or even millennia. What causes underlies such periodic abandonments will vary enormously, and of course, in the pre-modern era, we normally have no sources that shed light on this phenomenon, apart from, for example, signs of past earthquakes, something which has been investigated in southwestern Iran by Manuel Berberian. In the 19th century, however, some of the driving forces of settlement abandonment included cholera epidemics, plague, warfare, and drought. These phenomena undoubtedly played a role in the past as well, not only drastically reducing populations periodically, but causing major demographic shifts as some groups left their homes to establish new ones from scratch, while others joined existing settlements, swelling their numbers, and still others resettled on top of previously abandoned, unoccupied settlements. Neolocal residence patterns probably lurk behind some of the stratigraphic and architectural changes observed by archaeologists all the time. For instance, in the case of architecture built on a completely different orientation to that which might be found beneath it. A further marriage and hence kinship-related feature has also been invoked by Alizadeh in discussing the prehistoric cemeteries of Hakalan and Dumgar Parchine, already mentioned, excavated by the late Louis Vandenberger. Discussing the distribution of diverse objects found in tombs there, he suggested, quote, "Such objects, at least some of them, may have been part of the dowries acquired through interregional marriages, an important factor in forging interregional alliances through kinship. To the best of my knowledge, neither dowry nor bride price have elsewhere been invoked as mechanisms that could account for the spatial distribution of material culture in ancient Iran, though they have been in Mesopotamia. As such, they are interesting concepts to consider. Dowry, as Jack Goody noted almost half a century ago, can be seen as a type of pre-mortem inheritance to the bride. It was traditionally given from father to daughter without intermediaries taking a share. The evolutionary anthropologist Laura Fortunato in Oxford and colleagues have noted that, quote, "In monogamous societies characterized by uneven resource distribution, parents can increase their inclusive fitness by securing a high-status husband for their daughters. As a result, forms of female-biased parental investment, such as dowry, are more common in these societies than elsewhere. Like bride wealth or bride price, the transfer of wealth by the bridegroom and his family to the bride and her family, the movement of goods as dowry with a woman in a patrilocal situation could certainly, after a woman's death or the death of her descendants and inheritors, result in the appearance of what might be considered foreign items in graves, principally pieces of jewelry such as earrings, finger rings, and torques. Many items in the ancient dowry in Mesopotamia, for which we have written records from the 3rd through the 1st millennium BC, however, were perishable, such as various forms of clothing and other textiles, leather bags, reed baskets, animal hide rugs, tables, chairs, chests, beds, combs, and spoons of wood, not to mention slaves and oil. Equally, in some situations, land, a field, or a date grove might constitute part of a woman's dowry. On the other hand, some goods seem never to have typically formed part of a woman's dowry. As Stephanie Daly noted 40 years ago, with reference to Old Babylonian dowries in Mesopotamia of the early 2nd millennium BC, quote, although the basis of a dowry was to provide the needs of a domestic woman, none of these dowries include knives. Mirrors are also not found. A sieve is not found. Not every woman took spindles or a loom to the new house. In thinking of the archaeological correlates of dowries, however, we must also note that the diffusion of goods could be affected in other ways. As the Dutch Assyriologist Martin Stol noted, quote, as early as the betrothal, this is according to cuneiform texts, some or all of the dowry would be made over to the man, a practice which could result in the appearance of dowry objects in male as well as female graves. Similarly, the law code known as the Laws of Lipit Ishtar from the 19th century BC, in paragraph 24, stipulates that the dowry of a man's second wife could only be inherited by that woman's children, not those of the first-ranking wife, thereby potentially affecting the even wider dispersal of goods into the graves of both male and female descendants of the mother. And the Codex Hammurabi, paragraph 162, also says that a woman's dowry became the property of her children upon her death and did not revert to the woman's father who had originally given it or to her husband. We should note, however, that the payment of bride price or bride wealth by a man's family to his bride-to-be and her family could have had a similar long-term effect to a dowry, that is, shifting material from one community to another. It is not necessarily the case that this will be discernible either, however, particularly in societies where a great deal of wealth may take the form of herds, slaves, or land, all of which is attested as bride price. Be that as it may, the cases of Dumgar Parchineh and Hakalan are hardly suited to a discussion of dowry or any kind of property transfer, given the fact that although 20 prehistoric burials were excavated there, none of these have been sexed, and we cannot begin to discuss an institution like dowry when we have no idea whether any of the interments at Dumgar Parchineh and Hakalan belong to females. Moreover, I cannot imagine a situation in which it would be possible, except in cases of inscribed objects, to discriminate between foreign objects acquired originally as bride wealth or dowry from those that might have been obtained through straightforward barter or exchange of some sort, tempting as it might be to talk of dowry in the 5th millennium BC. Finally, I'd like to turn to the problem of the tribe as a social construct. As noted earlier, Abbas Alizadeh has invoked nomadic tribes as the agents of the dispersal of Bakun A culture over vast areas and asserted that we can reasonably demonstrate the presence of nomadic tribes. Nor was such a mechanism of diffusion limited to Fars, where Tali Bakun is located. Rather, in discussing ceramic parallels between sites in the Diyala, the Jebel Hamreen, East Tigris region of Iraq, and the Pushtiku regions of western Iran, of Luristan, during the late 4th, early 3rd millennium BC, he has suggested that these were the result of a coalition and close contacts among the mobile pastoral tribes in this region. Let us look then at the term tribe, particularly in view of the fact that scholars like Alizadeh, who invoke tribes and draw parallels with modern groups like the Kashkai and the Bakhtiari, never actually define the term. Although few of my colleagues not concerned with cuneiform law would begin in the first instance with the notion of Hausgemeinschaft, literally a house and the land appertaining to it, whether communally owned and worked or not, of single family, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, this is more or less what most of us probably have in mind when thinking about the smallest unit of social organization in Neolithic and Chalcolithic Iran. Even if the evidence from Tali Bakun does not warrant the assumption of social classes, other sites bear witness to much greater disparities in wealth at this time. In the 5th millennium BC cemetery at Toli Choga Sofla on the Zorhe Plain, excavated in 2015-16 by my former student Abbas Moghadam, Rich offerings were found in some graves, which included alabaster vessels, seals, copper bronze weaponry, vessels, discs, and beads and gold rings, gold beads, and gold discs. Cranial modification was also found in some cases, and although we're not sure what this means, whether it denoted high status, for example, it was clearly a sign of distinction. Differential access to wealth, as evidenced by smaller and larger multi-roomed houses or movable property, we know nothing of land ownership or herd size, is reasonable, therefore, to assume, given the pronounced variability in mortuary assemblages. But it is important to stress that all of this evidence pertains to sedentary communities. And thus the question must be asked, where do tribes fit into this discussion? In his classic study of 1961, Nomads of South Persia, the Norwegian anthropologist Fredrik Barth described tribes as agglomerations of descent groups or sections. These in turn were made up of herding units, usually 2 to 5 tents or families, which banded together and had what he called freedom of association on migrations and at campsites, consisting of 10 to 40 herding units. In a sense, the tent of the nomad offers a parallel to Weber's Hausgemeinschaft. Writing of the origins of the Basri, Barth noted that according to their own oral tradition, they had coalesced out of 2 distinct groups, the Wais, who originated in Khorasan, and the Ali Mirzai, who believed they originated locally in Fars. Yet some sections had different traditions, claiming Kashkai and even Arab descent. The fact that tribes are not necessarily composed of genetically related, linguistically homogeneous groups that originated in one area and sprang organically from a kin-related set of people recalls the late Pierre Oberling's definition of Turkic tribes. Tribe, he wrote, is a political rather than an ethnic concept. A tribe is a group of families or clans whose only bond is their pledge of allegiance to a common chief. Individual tribes tended to be ephemeral, he noted, whereas the tribal system itself displayed great resilience. Scholars like Abbas Alizadeh, who have invoked the existence of tribes in prehistoric Iran, have failed to articulate any details in their conception of what a prehistoric tribe might have looked like. But underlying this discussion is an unstated tenet corresponding to a broad social dichotomy that can be stated succinctly. Sedentary communities had one kind of social structure, whatever that may have been, whereas putative nomads were organized as tribes. Given our currently available range of data from later Iranian prehistory, it is difficult, not to say impossible, to see how one might discern those societal features which, for a Barth or an Oberling, are characteristic of tribes in prehistory. Moreover, it is clear from studies of Kurdish tribes that not all tribes were nomadic. Some were sedentary. Whether they had originally been nomadic is beside the point. The question is, can tribal social structure, if by that we mean divisions into descent groups and sections and loyalty to a chief, be maintained in a sedentary situation? The answer seems to be most definitively yes. That sedentism and tribalism are not incompatible concepts is well illustrated elsewhere in the Near East, for example in Yemen, where, as the late Robert B. Sargent used to stress, quote, tribesmen living in an urban situation could do so for generations without losing their tribal status. Whether the population of Talibakun A or any other prehistoric community in Iran was organized in a way that might resemble the later tribes of Iran is impossible to say. We have too little data to discern quarters in settlements, a feature often associated with tribal organization in towns and cities. And the material culture we most commonly recover in excavation, mud brick architecture, ceramics, ground stone, personal ornaments, seals, is simply unsuited to the discrimination of tribal from non-tribal social structure. The prudent approach, as I tried to follow in assessing the likelihood of nomadism in prehistory, is surely not to project a form of social organization onto a prehistoric situation, whether in Iran or anywhere else in the world, for which the evidence simply doesn't exist. Descent groups almost certainly existed in Iran's earliest sedentary communities, but their more precise characterization remains as elusive as ever. Thank you.